A delegation from the Taliban should be headed to Europe today, invited here by Belgium. The Taliban is the group that rules Afghanistan and since returning to power in 2021 has severely restricted or banned employment and education opportunities for women and girls. Amnesty International accuses the group of systematic suppression of dissent through extrajudicial execution and torture. So why are they coming here? Brussels says it's for migration talks, basically how to return failed asylum seekers back to Afghanistan, and that it doesn't mean it recognises the group. Taliban officials also came to Austria last year for similar talks. So today we're asking, is the EU normalising the Taliban by inviting them here? And what does it tell us about EU migration politics today? Well, Rosie Birchard is DW's Brussels correspondent. Rosie, hi there. Is it fair to say that Brussels has been a bit reticent about the details of this meeting since it was first reported?
Absolutely. And in fact, really it has been kind of media reports that have been driving discussion around this. At first, EU officials were pretty sketchy with details. They have now confirmed that talks are expected to go ahead. These are talks with EU officials, but because they're held in Brussels, it's the Belgian Foreign Ministry or Belgium that has to actually grant these visas. They're very limited visas, according to media reports, so just for the day and only for Belgium. Now, of course, these talks are about possible future deportations of Afghans back to Afghanistan. Now, there are thousands of Afghans who continue to come to the EU each year. Last year, it was around 73,000 people, and especially people who have committed crimes. There's a push from some EU member states to try and have more discussion on exactly what would be the technicalities of deporting those people in question. Now, the EU Commission is insisting these are technical talks, so that means there will be no ministers, government, kind of political figures there. Instead, rather lower level officials talking about technical details. Now, these may be the first talks of their kind in Brussels since the Taliban regained power in Afghanistan, but we have had similar kinds of talks in the past. So we know that Taliban officials have been in Austria before and that Germany has held discussions on migration and deportations with Taliban officials, though outside of Germany. And let's not forget that some EU countries, especially really Germany and Austria here, have already been deporting Afghan nationals with criminal records. That's happened already in a handful of cases.
And Rosie, does anything, all of this, what you've just said, say anything about how the EU views this as a sensitive problem?
It is definitely seen as sensitive, and that's of course because of the human rights violations documented in Afghanistan according to human rights watchdogs, and especially the restrictions that have been placed on women and girls with regards to access to education. But I should say, just kind of more broadly, the overall topic of migration and asylum policy has always been a sensitive issue here in Brussels. At least the kind of decade or so past, it has been kind of a politically toxic debate here for many years, but there has been a coalescence and really a shift to the right on migration policy across the EU, and there certainly is now a focus on trying to get more people deported. That is a stated on the record aim of the EU's new migration and asylum rules in order to try and, they say, speed up deportations.
Yeah, let's get to that in a little bit, Rosie. I first, though, want to listen to what the EU Commission said yesterday about these reported talks, and then we'll come back to you.
This is about having a technical level meeting with representatives of the de facto authorities of Afghanistan here in Brussels. This should be or should become a follow-up meeting to a first meeting that had already taken place in Afghanistan in January this year. Now, these technical level contacts, they come in response to an initiative by member states. Member states are looking into ways to return persons who have committed serious crimes and who are possibly a security threat.
So, Rosie, as you said earlier, the Commission says this meeting is technical. It doesn't mean recognition of the Taliban. It might not be formal recognition, but it's at least possibly de facto recognition, right?
It's definitely not formal recognition, and I think the European Commission would also push back on the idea that it is de facto recognition. They absolutely do not recognise the Taliban as a legitimate government there. But what I think many campaigners are concerned about is that they see this as normalization. And that is not an official diplomatic term, really, essentially, in this case, right? What they're talking about is the fear that step by step, these kind of meetings start to legitimize the Taliban as a kind of a figure or an organization of authority. And that is something that they, as Taliban officials, can then go into rooms with in other fora. So if they're going to talk to other countries, the fact they've held talks with the EU might be something that they want to show off as proof of more of their acceptance in international fora. So the accusation here is that step by step, the EU is, through holding these kind of talks, normalising the Taliban.
From the EU's perspective, though, did it have any other options if it wants to address this issue other than to speak to the rulers of Afghanistan, which are the Taliban?
If it wants to address the issue of returning Afghans, especially people with criminal records, you have to have talks with the authorities in place or those that are in power. And they have wrestled with this in all sorts of other situations, things like Syria. Of course, the other option, human rights campaigners would say, is to simply not deport Afghans. And most EU countries haven't been deporting Afghan citizens until now. Germany has in a select number of cases, and so has Austria. And they've also received heavy criticism for doing so. Those cases have been cases of people who have criminal records.
Why did Belgium feel the need to invite these Taliban representatives to come to Brussels? Couldn't they have met somewhere else, like Qatar, possibly?
Well, they already met in Afghanistan, and I think there are definitely other options for holding these talks, which of course would have drawn slightly less criticism, perhaps, or at least less media attention. But the fact is, we've already had these talks taking place, for example, in Vienna, in the case of Austria, and I think there's also there's been a push from the Taliban side to come and have these talks in person here. I'm really not privy to the details of this, as you rightly mentioned. The EU has kind of shrouded these meetings in mystery, in a sense, and there could have been other options of where to hold them, but for whatever reason, they've decided Brussels is the place to be and that they have to move forward in this way. And of course, let's not forget the people that deal with this at a technical level at the European side are based here in Brussels. This is where the European Commission is based. It's the EU's executive, and EU member states, at least around about 20 of them, there are 27, so 20 of them have asked the Commission on the record formally to try and push for these kind of more possibilities in order to deport Afghans. So the Commission says they are responding to requests from member states, not doing anything just on their own initiative.
Yeah, let's talk about that a little bit more. As you say, a majority of member states, they want these kinds of firmer legal pathways to deport Afghans who don't have a legal right to stay and who they say pose a security risk. How big of an issue or problem is this right now, I guess, for these countries?
It's becoming more and more of a headline issue. You hear in closed-door briefings diplomats and officials talking about this more and more. With regards to Afghanistan, I think the fact is that now we've had several years of the Taliban being in power there, the effective authorities, and I think that has meant that bit by bit EU states, those of whom are really pushing on this, have said, look, it's time to start these deportations. Let's recall that before the Assad regime fell in Syria, ushering in new authorities, several EU member states were actually already pushing to deport Syrians back to Assad-era Syria. So this is not a kind of unique debate in this way. What I would say is that overall, the question of how to return people who have no right to remain because a court has seen their case and decided they should not have the right to remain in the European Union. That is a really difficult and thorny issue for the EU because, here's a statistic for you. Less than 1 in 3 people who are deemed not to be able to stay in the EU through a legitimate judicial process actually then leave. So the EU is trying to hold all sorts of talks with different governments around the world to try and increase cooperation on returns. One case, for example, to mention is Bangladesh. The EU has over the past few years held quite intensive discussions with Bangladesh to try and basically encourage governments to take back their citizens. In order to organise that, you need that kind of cooperation. And of course, what's difficult in this case is that comparing, for example, authorities in Bangladesh with the Taliban, totally different story, because because specifically in this case of those human rights violations, the accusations thereof that have been laid at the feet of the Taliban.
Yeah, and Rosie, I think you mentioned it was 20 member states, was it? Is there growing unity in Brussels among EU member states about, I guess, deporting particularly those who've been accused or who have committed serious crimes?
Yes. There has been a shift in this over the last few years, absolutely a shift to the right, a shift toward more restrictive migration policies. And I think governments would say that what they are responding to is the will of voters. Now, of course, what we've seen right across this bloc is more the rise of more far-right governments, or at least far-right parties. Some hard-right parties are already in power in different EU countries, and certainly where they are not, governments, centrist governments, feel that they are really facing a threat from rising popularity of far-right parties. And that is what many analysts say has pushed governments toward more restrictive and hardline migration policies. Those in power across the EU are saying, look, what we're doing is responding to what voters want and also trying to fix a problem which is also a problem for those people involved. So the question around deportations, for example, there's often what EU officials often say, it's also no good for those who are no longer legally able to remain, but are not able to be deported because oftentimes, they have to sort of live outside the system. They are not legally present in the country. And that is not a good situation for anyone either. So the EU is really defending this policy of shifting to the right on migration. And it certainly is something on which there has been much more unity in recent years, although a unity which has been broadly criticised by many human rights organisations and watchdogs.
Thanks a lot for that, Rosie. We've been speaking to our correspondent, Rosie Birchard in Brussels. Shagofah Ghafori is Programs and Partnerships Manager at the Centre for European Policy Studies, speaking to us today from Brussels. Welcome to you. Now, you've called this invitation to the Taliban delegation a grave mistake. Tell us why.
Well, it's clearly because there is a huge risk of normalizing one of the most repressive regimes in the world, because clearly Taliban are not simply another government with whom the EU has strong diplomatic relations and a common language to speak about. But on the contrary, they're accused of systematic violence and discrimination on the ground in Afghanistan, especially on women. And this is what is called gender apartheid in Afghanistan, because women are clearly deprived of their basic human rights only based on their gender. Besides this, there are a lot of other facts from the ground that shows grave violation of human rights, a lack of a healthcare system, the situation that there is no rule of law, etc. And these are all clearly show that engagement with such a regime, while we are well aware of what is going on in Afghanistan, carries a high risk that we are normalizing a regime, that the EU is normalizing a regime that is accused of these violations. And there are even arrest warrants against the leaders of this regime by the International Criminal Court. And so under these conditions, having them and inviting them to Brussels is clearly just normalizing a regime that has no common value with us. And on the contrary, everything that are the fundamentals of this regime is against what we believe.
You're saying that this meeting risks normalising the Taliban. The European Commission has said that the meeting is technical and that it doesn't mean it recognises the Taliban. It's essentially saying it's got no choice but to speak to the group about this. Do you reject that then?
Well, there is nothing technical about having relations and discussing migration or anything with a regime that is accused of huge human rights violations and despite the current situation in Afghanistan. So this meeting might not be a formal, let's say, recognition of the Taliban's government, but it is something far worse. It is normalizing what is going on in Afghanistan, and it's sending a very wrong signal, actually. It is saying that the EU is fine to discuss your regime that is based on oppression, and it is based on suppressing women and depriving human beings from their basic human rights. And I don't think this is what EU is standing for. And I don't think that the pressure that we are getting from the far right today should push us into a situation that we are sending a wrong signal about our values and what we are standing by. And so the recognition doesn't need, normalization doesn't need a formal recognition. It happens incrementally through visas and having them here for meetings and discussing with them over different issues. And I think the normalization happens just today behind the closed doors, where they are discussing with the Taliban, and no one else is on the table.
I want to get to some of the...
Yes, it's
sorry to interrupt. I want to get to some of these political pressures you mentioned a bit earlier, particularly coming from the far right. But just to ask you again, if the EU refuses to engage with the Taliban at all, how exactly do you propose handling the deportations of individuals who have no legal right to stay in Europe?
I think beyond what I would propose, there are legal frameworks that is binding and that are guiding all of us and the EU clearly how to manage migration. First and foremost, every human being deserves to be safe, and there are laws and regulations that says that you cannot send anyone back to where they face torture, discrimination, and where they cannot exercise their basic human rights. I think this draws a very clear line for us on what to do, especially for the EU, on how to manage migration. If we know that in the current situation, there is no legal framework that really allow us to discuss deportations and to actually work on the deportation, I think this is then the right moment where to work around other options, other more legal options and better options that are resettlement, and making sure that all those who worked for the EU and who defended human rights, they have the right and the right pathways to come to Europe through legal means, and to have more educational pathways, and to have other more lawful opportunities for people to migrate to Europe. And I think this is a much better option rather than, let's say, discussing with a regime with whom we don't have any common language.
Just for some clarity, is it your view then that no person from Afghanistan should be deported from Europe to Afghanistan under any circumstances right now?
Well, clearly the human rights reports from Afghanistan, there are dozens of them done by EU, done by UN, and done by other international organizations that clearly shows that it is not only women who are facing the huge human rights crisis in Afghanistan, but there are other categories, especially, for example, if you're religious, it's a really multi-factor situation. If you're a religious minority, if you're even fairly tied to the previous government, if you have served in the military, if you're from an ethnic minority, if you come from a specific place in the country, a lot of different factors are in play here. And they clearly show that there is no safe category of returnees to Afghanistan. And in the meantime, I think not to have a framework, these situations should be assessed case by case, considering the different facts in play.
Okay. I want to get onto these political pressures now that you mentioned a little bit earlier. You've written that Brussels is kowtowing to narrow political pressures. Could such a position fuel even more political backlash and strengthen these kinds of far-right movements who are calling for even harsher policies towards migration?
Well, I think the far right should not dictate the human rights policy, and also I have also argued that compromising some core principles to neutralize far right pressure rarely works, because instead it risks validating the narrative that human rights values are actually they are negotiable. And I think again that this is not the right signal that we want to send. We should be confident enough to defend the EU borders, and in the meantime keep the human rights values that we are standing by and that we are committed to valuing. And I think that we should not sacrifice one for the other. On the other hand as well, even if the EU manages to send back a few migrants, I think there is only one winner to these negotiations, and that is the Taliban. And it is clear that the Taliban know the benefits that they are taking from these negotiations, and that is why they are actively promoting these, and they are actively working towards having more negotiations with and more presence in the EU. We have read that they would like to send more diplomats to Germany now. So it shows here that the winner of these discussions, it will not be the far right, it will not be the EU. There will be only one winner here, and that's the Taliban, because they will eventually normalize whatever they are doing on the ground in Afghanistan through these political meetings, through their presence in the EU, and through these discussions.
So you're saying it's winning, and you've outlined some benefits. What are some of these benefits you're arguing, I guess, for it, that it would give it increased legitimacy?
Well, it is clear that the Taliban have been trying very strongly to have a better presence in the EU and in its member states. And you have seen that by their presence in Germany. And it is a little bit, a little bit beyond all our imaginations that the Taliban are now recruiting interns for their embassy, which technically means that their ideology and their presence in the EU is just being strengthened. And in some way, not only this presence, but the extreme ideology that the Taliban are representing, and that is currently being indoctrinated in brains of young kids and children in Afghanistan through thousands of madrasas that they have built through the last years, that their ideology is spreading as well. So in this way, not only we are allowing a regime and the representative of a regime that is clearly tied to discrimination of human rights values to have a presence in our territory, but on the other hand, we are letting an extreme ideology to spread around the EU. And I think this only serves to the benefits of the Taliban and not for the EU. On the other hand as well, there were preconditions set by the EU clearly on discussions and negotiations with the Taliban. We have seen through the last 5-6 years that they have not taken only one step towards the fulfilling any of these conditions that were clearly based on human rights and equality and women presence and education. And so now EU is sending the signal that we are just ignoring all the preconditions that we have set only because we would like to have these negotiations. On the other hand, the EU is already having a delegation in Afghanistan, so it means that they might have some sort of technical negotiations or operational engagement with the Taliban already. And so inviting them to Brussels is definitely going too far in these engagements.
It's been great to speak with you. Thank you so much, Shagofah Ghafori, Programs and Partnerships Manager at the Centre for European Policy Studies.
Thank you for having me.
So it's time for you to weigh in. We'd really like to know your thoughts about this Taliban meeting and what both Rosie and Shagofah have had to say. Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel. I'm Jared Reid in Berlin. Take care.